Jordan Peterson sat down in a room surrounded by 20 atheists, and it seems like everybody's talking about it. This was for the Jubilee YouTube channel, and if you haven't seen one of these yet, typically it's one person sits in the middle, surrounded by a group who are ideologically opposed to them in some way or other. And then that person asserts a proposition, and those in the circle rush the chair, kind of extreme, what's the game, musical chairs, that sort of style. They'll rush the other chair. Whoever gets there first gets to engage with that person and debate that proposition. It was originally billed as one Christian versus 20 atheists, but then it was changed to Jordan Peterson versus 20 atheists. I suspect it's because he refuses to identify as a Christian. There seemed to be some miscommunication there.
Why are you asking me that?
Because you're a Christian.
You say that. I haven't claimed that.
Oh, what is this? Is this Christians versus atheists?
I don't know.
I was under the impression I was invited to talk to a Christian. Am I not talking to a Christian?
No, you were invited to.
I think everyone should look at the title of the YouTube channel.
Now, many will find this discussion pretty frustrating, whether theist or atheist, I think. In this video, I'm going to describe why I think many will find it frustrating, and then offer some insights relevant to the discussion. Some will find it frustrating because this group of atheists were, at least in my opinion, too combative. They're not super informed, and we just don't get a lot of thoughtful debate. Almost all of them seem to be primarily aimed at gotcha moments and getting Jordan Peterson to contradict himself in some way or other.
So if I don't worship anything, my life will not be meaningful, correct?
Well, that's the definition of nihilism.
Okay, so if I'm a nihilist, I don't worship anything.
That's true. And then you.
Oh, okay. You just said everybody worships something. I think you just agreed there is a class of people that doesn't.
Well, they're incoherent in their worship, and hand gestures like that aren't going to help.
All right.
And there were some ugly moments, I think, or some of them were downright rude.
You're really quite something, you are.
Aren't I? But you're really quite nothing, right? You're not a Christian.
Okay, I'm done with him.
I've seen people playing this clip saying that this kid owned Jordan Peterson, and I just really disagree. I don't think there's anything hard about what he did. It's not substantive. It's really just not a debate at this point when one is doing this kind of thing. To me, he was the worst of them, but there were others that were simply trying to win a point or, again, get these sort of gotcha moments. A lot of them just seemed really nervous, really jumpy. I mean, it's somewhat understandable. I mean, this is a very large channel. I think it has something like 10 million subscribers, and you're sitting down with a very famous person. So I can imagine being pretty nervous to come face to face with Jordan Peterson on some of these issues. And Jordan Peterson is, well, Jordan Peterson. He can be great. I like Jordan Peterson. I like listening to him sometimes. He can be great in long-form dialogue. But this is probably not the best setting for him, right? Jordan Peterson will often just sort of talk all around an issue, again, saying what I think are sometimes interesting things, often very provocative things, but he just never kind of gets right directly on an issue, never gives kind of a straightforward analysis of things. And then I think most atheists, at least this group of atheists, tend to be pretty analytic in some ways. They want strict definitions, they want clear premises, and let's hear the argument and let's debate the argument. But Peterson is definitely not an analytic. And so you kind of put a bunch of analytics together with a non-analytic, and it's going to feel like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. Peterson does a lot of dancing around, and the atheists are forced to keep chasing him around the circle, and it proves pretty frustrating. Almost comically at times, Peterson would say, well, it depends on what you mean by that, or how do you define this?
Well, it depends on what you mean by belief. It depends on what you mean by happy, and it depends on the duration that you're trying to calculate over. What do you mean by just?
just?
It depends on how you define your benefit. If
it's going to come at your expense, would you still follow it?
So do you believe in the all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good notion of God?
What do you mean by believe? It depends on what you mean by valid. So far, so good, but it depends on what you mean by valid.
You even see the various respondents starting to smile and laugh each time he does this. Now, I know this bothers people, but I'm not completely against it. I mean, this is kind of what many philosophers do, and when I'm having a philosophical discussion with someone, I will very often say, well, it really depends on what you mean by this, how you define this term or how you're understanding it. Now, it's a problem when we do this to just avoid, right, a kind of implication of something that we've said. That's when it becomes a dodge. And let's be honest, I think Jordan Peterson probably does this a number of times. But I think at the end of the day, to press for clear definitions and to sort of see how important it is to clarify what one means by a particular concept or a particular term, I mean, this is just hugely important for these sorts of debates. But nonetheless, this is not Jordan Peterson's best setting for his approach, his style. It gets very chippy at times and, again, not very productive. So it's a bit of a mess, but messy, it's probably what we should expect when worldviews collide. But I think there's some insights we can draw from this. So let's look at Peterson's first proposition.
My first claim, atheists reject God, but they don't understand what they're rejecting.
Now, as I understand it, Peterson's point here is that atheists will often reject a very kind of thin version of God. Maybe it's the bearded guy in the sky, right? Or I've heard a prominent atheist say that he doesn't believe in the Iron Age God who has anger and jealousy problems.
Oh, don't grovel. One thing I can't stand is people groveling. Sorry.
Now, it's fine if you reject these ideas of God, but here's the thing. I do too. I don't believe in the bearded guy in the sky. I don't believe in the Iron Age God with anger and jealousy problems. And I'm not sure I've met a theist that believes in these concepts of God either. These are all very small and very thin notions of God. What you honestly don't hear described very often by atheists when they reject God, especially on a kind of popular level atheism, is God who is the very ground of being, or other more robust views of God. Now, Jordan Peterson states his proposition quite absolutely, right? And again, probably trying to be intentionally provocative. He's something of a provocateur, I think, at least. And that's fine, but it does sort of derail the discussion from the beginning, because the obvious rejoinder is, how do you know I don't understand God properly?
What was off about my aim in the first place?
I don't know. That might take a long time to figure out.
But then it seems kind of like this no true Scotsman type of fallacy in which you're the arbiter of people's aims and how they understand those aims to be. How is it that you can claim that people don't know something that you know about their life despite not having met them?
No, I'm not sure we have a no true Scotsman fallacy here. I think the best way to understand this fallacy is when one confuses an idealized version of something with what it minimally takes to be that thing. Let me try to give you an illustration here. Suppose that I were to say all Americans are honorable. Right? And someone points out, well, this guy John is an American and he's not honorable. And then rather than address that counterexample, what I do is double down and say, well, John is not a true American then. But clearly what it is to be an American is just to be a citizen in the United States, right? So it's just a dodge to say, well, this is not a true American. I'm confusing an idealized version of what it is to be an American from what it minimally takes to be an American. Now, when Peterson says that atheists don't know what they're rejecting or don't understand what they're rejecting, I don't know that this is a no true Scotsman fallacy straightforwardly, but I get the frustration. There are certain views out there where when someone rejects the view, the most common rejoinder is just to say, look, you just don't understand the view. And that can be pretty frustrating, but I'm not sure that's what Jordan Peterson is doing here. He articulates it a little better in this way.
It's obviously a generic claim, just like the atheist claim that there's no God is a generic claim. In your case, it would have to be specified more, and I'm not claiming to understand what was going on in your mind, but my experience with atheists is twofold, is that they have a very reductive notion of what constitutes God, let's say in the Judeo-Christian tradition. And they've often been hurt by someone who was religious or by the religious enterprise or perhaps by God himself, so to speak, and that's left them with an animus.
So I think his point is just that atheists will tend to sort of reduce, and I should say the atheists, more of the sort of new atheist variety, tend to reduce God down into a very rejectable thing, a very objectionable thing. But that's ends up just being a straw man or straw God, if you like. Now, do atheists always do this? Do they always straw man the theist or always misunderstand what they are rejecting? Well, here I'm going to say this depends, right? I told you I do the Jordan Peterson thing a lot. Depends what you mean by that. There is one line of thinking that I find very powerful, very intriguing, very interesting, where the answer to this question would then be yes. Here's the idea. Maybe one has to reduce God down in order to reject him. Perhaps God, in his biggest possible sense, is not rejectable. This, in many ways, is the point that Anselm, Archbishop of Canterbury, famously made many centuries ago. He sees God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. And God, as such, can't fail to exist. The idea, sometimes called perfect being theology, is that God, by definition now, has all perfections. Now, I'm blown away by this idea. I think this is just such a rich line of reasoning and line of thinking, is so fruitful in so many ways. In fact, I think this is one of the greatest philosophical innovations in the history of philosophy. Is it greater to be all-powerful or limited in power? Well, obviously it's greater for a being to be all-powerful. Is it greater for God to be omniscient or to fail to know certain propositions or truths? Well, obviously it's greater for God to be omniscient, therefore God must be omniscient. We can, in this way, fill out and understand who God is if God is, by definition, that than which nothing greater can be conceived. So if there is some limitation or imperfection to the being that one has in mind, then what I want to suggest by this sort of Anselmian reasoning is that we're just not talking about God anymore. So we can call the Greek and Roman gods, right? But if we're describing, say, Zeus or Apollo as limited in power, or sometimes evil, as they are in the stories, then sort of leaving aside whether or not they exist, I just don't even think we're talking about God. At best, we're talking about something like superhumans. Or a more contemporary situation when the Mormon, let's say, or the Latter-day Saint says that God was once a man. I just think we have a very different concept in mind. I just don't even think we're talking about God anymore. Or even take, for example, Philip Goff's recent embrace of a God of limited power, which I shot a whole video on some of that. You can check out in the notes below. My issue with Goff's notion of God is that I just don't think it's God. So here's the thought relating Anselm's argument to Jordan Peterson's proposition here. A being that can't fail to exist seems greater than a being that can fail to exist. If God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, then he can't, by this reasoning, fail to exist. Right? Here's the thought, right? He's too big for that. He's too great. There's a lot to this, and it's a very serious idea. It's a very serious thought. It really just comes down to whether or not it's greater for God to be a necessary being, the kind of necessary ground of all other being. If it's greater for God to be a necessary being, then he must exist. He can't not exist. On this view, you can imagine a world in which Thor or Zeus or Apollo doesn't exist. You can imagine a world in which the bearded guy in the sky doesn't exist, but you can't imagine a world in which the necessary ground of being does not exist. If this is right, then Peterson's right. God can only be rejected insofar as he's misunderstood. Now, is this what Jordan Peterson has in mind? I don't see any indication that he has a kind of Anselmian perfect being theology notion of God here. But he might have something like that in mind. He kind of goes, as he does, into what I thought was a pretty odd way to define God. At one point, he starts to talk about how the prophet Elijah defines God, which, again, this is a sort of strained reading of the text. I'm not sure Elijah is defining God this way. But I think what he's referring to is First Kings 19, where God shows up as the sort of still small voice or the gentle whisper. But Peterson will say that Elijah is defining God as the voice of conscience within. I just don't think this is a good definition of God. I mean, it might be what God does. He might speak through our conscience. I think he does speak through our conscience. In any case, I'm sticking with Anselm. God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. It makes sense of why we would worship God in this ultimate sense, is because God is the ultimate being. He's the necessary ground of all existence. Now, Peterson refuses a number of times, as he's done many, many times in the past. He refuses to identify as a Christian. Again, this precipitates a change of the video's title. Many people on both sides, Christians, atheists, theists, non-theists, have found this to be disappointing and frustrating, but I'm honestly not sure why this is so frustrating for people. I suspect they want him to identify as a Christian so they can pin him down with some things, and he's just not going to be pinned down. That's just not something he's going to accept. Now, for one, I'm okay with the fact that he refuses to identify as a Christian, because I don't think Jordan Peterson is a Christian. I mean, at least I don't have obvious evidence of this. I think he's a theist, but even as we've seen in this video, the way he defines God is often in these sort of non-standard ways. There's probably a loose sense in which he's a Christian. He certainly seems to think highly of Christ and be a follower of Christ in some sense or other. But again, it's often in very non-standard ways. So for one, I'm okay with the fact that he doesn't identify as a Christian, because I don't think he is one. Now, I think he is on a journey of sorts. And again, I like listening to Jordan Peterson at times. He definitely seems captivated by the biblical narratives. I mean, he talks about the biblical narratives all the time. It kind of doesn't matter where he is or who he's talking to. The biblical narratives will be brought up. And we see it all throughout this Jubilee video, right? He will reference the biblical narratives. And I like this, but again, does he understand these biblical narratives in the categories as most Christians do? I think definitely not. He's got some pretty wacky views about the Bible and about these biblical narratives. He treats them almost always in this sort of highly symbolic way or this metaphorical way. And he really just doesn't seem to be interested in the historicity of the biblical claims almost at all. And again, like I do, I very much care whether or not these historical stories are describing actual history. And I like to think about that sort of stuff. Now, I like the symbolic stuff too, like what these stories mean and how we can apply them to our lives in a broader sense and so on. Like, that's all well and good, but it seems to me that much turns on whether or not these historical stories are actually, historical, that they are actually true, that they actually happened in history. As I've said before, Jordan Peterson has made talking about God cool again on a very large stage. And I think that there are a lot of people talking about God today, and he sort of, was the trailblazer for that in some ways. But his approach is almost always going to be messy. And at the end of the day, my worry is that Jordan Peterson wrestles not so much with God as much as he wrestles with the idea or some sort of symbolic version of God. Now, the symbolic or the conceptual discussions, right, they're not unimportant. In fact, I think that they are crucially important. But at the same time, you can miss God for the mere idea of God. But I hope he continues the journey. In fact, I hope he finds God. I'd probably suggest that he stays away from the short-form analytic debates with atheists.